If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoyed this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hoxton. There is absolutely nothing more exciting than picking up a book about a subject or a person that you didn't know about, because it taps into our natural curiosity and sense of discovery. Every page offers new revelations and perspectives, and that allows us to explore uncharted intellectual territory. And that by itself is just hugely exciting. It broadens our understanding, it introduces fresh ideas, and I think it often shifts our worldview, which is also important. There's also an incredible serendipitous joy in stumbling upon unexpected insights or stories that resonate deeply, which ignite a passion for further exploration. Aphra Behn was one such story for me. She, as it turned out, was this incredible trailblazing figure in the world of literature, and she's often hailed as one of the first Englishwomen to earn a living by her pen. You know, she lived in a time when women's voices were largely stifled, and she defied convention. Her works were bold, they were daring, they were unapologetically rebellious, often addressing themes of love and power and politics in a way that completely shocked and yet captivated Restoration audiences. Beyond her literary contributions as a poet and a playwright, Behn also led a fascinating life as a spy for the English crown, adding an element of intrigue to her already extraordinary story. Her legacy, I think, is one of breaking barriers and influencing the generations of female writers that then followed through the centuries. To Aphra Behn, the tale of the runaway daughter, Lady Henrietta Berkeley, and her scandalous affair and equally dramatic subsequent trial was rich material for some of the most outrageous and best-selling political fiction of the 17th century, hands down. That said, Behn's own life, I think, was as equally exciting. I just finished reading author Lisa Hilton's new book, The Scandal of the Century, which effectively untangles the story of these two particular women. It touches on the lives of these two women caught up in the triangle of societal exception versus personal choice. But I think I have to start this incredibly exciting story, I have to say, with one of them and bring you into my fold, into what I know. So, in the late 17th century, a young woman in the midst of a passionate affair flees her family home to seek a new life with her lover in London. And that's a scandal in its own right. But this is no ordinary young woman. And let me set the scene by introducing you to Lady Henrietta Berkeley. So first of all, who is she? Who is Lady Henrietta Berkeley, who at the time of her elopement was just 18 years of age? She was the daughter of the first Earl of Berkeley, and the Berkeley family were one of the most prominent aristocratic families in all of England. They were stupendously wealthy, incredibly powerful, and very well connected, particularly at court because her father had been a staunch supporter of Charles II, who had quite recently returned as king after the Civil Wars. But what really made this scandal explode was that Henrietta's lover was her own brother-in-law. So he was married to Henrietta's sister Mary, and her brother-in-law and lover was Ford Lord Grey, who was aged 27 to her 18 years on the day that she actually ran away from her parents' home and vanished into the underworld of London. And Grey is a fascinating, divisive, captivating figure of his time. Now, if we were to envision Henrietta, what would she look like? How would she act? Well, we've actually got a pretty good description of Henrietta's physical appearance because her parents, the Earl and Countess of Berkeley, were so desperate to get their daughter back that they took a really unprecedented step and they advertised for her publicly in the London Gazette. And the London Gazette describes her as a young lady of fair complexion, fair head, full-breasted, and indifferent to all. Later editions of the London Gazette actually removed the reference to Lady Henrietta's bosom. Obviously, that was one step too far. And for any information concerning their daughter, the Earl and Countess offered £200. That's a lot of money then. That would be the equivalent to £16,000 today. So they were obviously very keen to get her back. So the characters are now in play, and I will now set the scene for you. So how did this affair actually go down? Well, Henrietta escaped from her parents' house at the end of August in 1682. In September, her parents placed the advertisement in the London Gazette, and when this failed to yield any results whatsoever, her father, the Earl of Berkeley, took the unprecedented step and brought a civil suit against Henrietta's lover, Ford Lord Grey, at the King's Bench Court in Westminster in London. And he basically accused Lord Grey of enticing Lady Henrietta into an ungodly and profligate life. Essentially, what we have here, folks, is an argument about a piece of property. As far as the Earl of Berkeley is concerned, Henrietta, as his daughter, who was still a minor, she was under 21, which is the age of majority at the time, she was his property, and he wanted to get her back, and he was prepared to go to extraordinary lengths to do so. So Lord Grey was obliged to appear in court, having been imprisoned. The case was heard to a packed courtroom. You can imagine this is the scandal of the century. The whole of London was talking about this, and various witnesses were interviewed, including Henrietta's mother and her sisters, but also a midwife, a lodging housekeeper, and the various servants who'd also been involved in Henrietta's escape. And as the Lord Chief Justice, Sir Francis Pemberton, began his summing up, something even more scandalous happened, which is that Henrietta, who was a minor, who was a woman, who was forbidden to speak in court, stood up, interrupted the judge, and then denounced the charges against her. This had never happened before in the history of English law. She then said that she refused to go home with her father and that she was her own mistress because she was already married to another man, a man called William Turner. At this point, her father, the Earl, and her lover, Ford Lord Grey, actually drew their swords and lunged at each other simultaneously. Henrietta herself had to be restrained. Here was her father attacking her lover by the court's bailiffs, 3 of them. And then, of course, the whole of Westminster Hall exploded. People were trying to stop the 2 men from killing one another. The bailiffs were trying to hold down Henrietta, and a fight had broken out at the back, and it was just absolute, complete chaos. So, what was the result of the trial? Well, in the end, it was proved that Henrietta was indeed married to William Turner, who was a servant of Lord Grey. And it appears that the 2 lovers had found this expedient as a means of explaining away Henrietta's freedom from her father's control. Henrietta, as a married woman, was therefore independent. She was no longer subject to her father's control, but her husband's control. And of course, her husband worked for Ford Lord Grey. So the court had no choice but to drop the charges. Henrietta then went off with Ford Lord Grey to Holland, where they spent the next few years. So what happens then? What do we know about their later lives? Well, we know very little about Henrietta, but one of the exciting aspects of reading this book was then doing some of my own research, trying to tease her name out of, other documents from parish records, from the chancellery suits. On the other hand, what we do know a great deal about is Ford Lord Grey, because he was one of the conspirators in what became known as the Monmouth Revolution. So quite shortly after the trial, there was a rebellion staged by Charles II's illegitimate eldest son, James, Duke of Monmouth. And the objective was to effectively remove the claim to the throne of Charles's younger brother, who was a Catholic, and replace him ultimately with the Duke of Monmouth. And Ford Lord Grey was one of the primary conspirators in this plot, which resulted in a pitched battle at Sedgemoor in Somerset in 1685, in which Monmouth was defeated, and he was subsequently imprisoned and executed in the Tower of London. And this was also the last pitched battle that was ever fought on English soil. So all the time that Henrietta and Lord Grey were on the run and going through court, he was actually fomenting a political revolution. And of course, this is the amazing backstory, if you like, of what I think is the first novel in English, the first ever novel penned by Aphra Behn, which she called Letters Between a Nobleman and His Sister. Aphra Behn very much becomes part of this story through her novel, which is otherwise known as Love Letters. Let me now introduce you to her. So Aphra Behn is one of the most important and also one of the most mysterious figures in English literature. She was England's first professional woman writer. She was a poet and a playwright. She was also a secret agent. She was sometimes a jailbird, and she was friends with some of the most prominent and influential people of her age. She was also witness to one of the most tumultuous events in English history. And yet, we know almost nothing about her. Most people would never have heard of her name. So we don't know much, but what we do get is glimpses of her, and that's really important. For about 50 years, there has been an accepted version of the biography of Aphra Behn, which has been very carefully and meticulously pieced together by generations of amazing scholars, of brilliant scholars. And this accepted version is that Aphra Behn began life as Aphra Johnson. And this Aphra Johnson was daughter of a barber and his wife, Elizabeth, who was a wet nurse, and that they lived in Canterbury. As I say, a great deal of effort and scholarship has been put into making this backstory for Aphra. And the only problem that I have with it is that it actually makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever, which is one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk about her on this podcast. So what I'm offering is an analysis of Aphra Behn's involvement in the trial of Lady Henrietta Berkeley and the way in which it inspired her to write the first novel ever written by a woman in English literature, but also a completely new possible theory, I guess an exploration of the fact that Aphra Behn was probably not English, as they claim, but an American. And I actually think that she may have been from the eastern seaboard of the United States, or she may have been from the West Indies, but there's absolutely no reason to believe that she was a barber's daughter from Canterbury. Absolutely none. And this backstory, isn't it the perfect backstory if you were a spy? So how did I come to these conclusions? The Aphra Johnson theory is based upon two biographies which were published after Aphra Behn died, both of which are entirely, I think, or almost entirely fictitious. The details of those biographies were then, I suppose they were commented upon by, the details of those two biographies were then commented on by a lady called Anne Finch, who was a countess. You know, she was a former lady in waiting at the court, and her husband had property in Kent. And she made a rather mean comment in a margin on a poem she'd written about Aphra Behn, saying that she was not a gentleman's daughter, but was in fact the daughter of a barber. And I think that's where that story comes from. And I think it was a case of mistaken identity, because there was indeed an Aphra Behn living in Kent at the same time that the Countess made the comment, but she wasn't the writer Aphra Behn. I mean, it's an incredibly unusual name. And what makes it so confusing is that there were two of them living at the same time. But this Aphra Behn actually went by Aphra Smithert, who remarried a man called Mr. Amos, who remarried a man called Mr. Behn, and had 8 children with him, and she died in Canterbury. And that's where I think the confusion comes in. The second thing that's most important in Aphra Behn's professional life is that she springs into existence in the year 1666 at the stroke of a civil servant's pen, when she's mentioned in connection with a spying mission to the Netherlands. And the person who selected her for this spying mission was a man called Thomas Killigrew. He was a playwright, he was a courtier, he was master of the King's Theatre and Charles I and II's jester. This guy was an incredibly colorful and controversial figure at court, and he mixed with all the great personalities of his time, and he actually left an indelible mark on the English theatre scene. So the question then is, why would Thomas Killigrew select a barber's daughter from Kent? And no one has been able to explain how not only wrote beautifully, but spoke fluent French and Dutch, and later in life was able to trade quips with the poet laureate. Why would Thomas Killigrew be interested in a barber's daughter? The answer to that is that he wouldn't. And I think what's really interesting is that we all have an idea about social differences, which has been conditioned, I think, by shows like Downton Abbey. We think of Upstairs, Downstairs, which came out, in the 1970s. And, these sorts of convivial relations that existed between the upper and the lower classes. And here's the thing. In the 17th century, this was not the case. It was a much more cruel and brutal world when it came to class. In the eyes of the aristocracy, you were essentially subhuman if you weren't aristocracy. So the idea that this barber's daughter, whose mother couldn't write, appears from absolutely nowhere as the trusted confidant, as a member of the court of the government, just seems to me to be completely implausible. So I started looking for alternative theories as to who Aphra Behn might be. And just going back to Anne Finch, the Countess, who made the remark about her being a barber's daughter, Anne Finch was friends with Thomas Killigrew's sister. They'd both been ladies-in-waiting at court, and Anne Finch believed that Aphra Behn had been born in Wye in Kent. In fact, Thomas Killigrew, who had wide and complex connections as a spy master in what was then called the New World, the Americas, was also connected with a place in Maryland, a plantation in Maryland called Wye in the county of Kent. And I think that's where that whole story gets confused. So the argument with regards to who Aphra Behn was is both wrong and it's right. The Countess definitely had the wrong woman, but the right birthplace. Thomas Killigrew was working with a woman who had nothing to do with barbers and certainly nothing to do with mothers who were wet nurses, but who did have strong connections with the New World and the English, the nascent English colonies in the West Indies. This is where I think Aphra Behn, the playwright, the writer, the poet, the spy comes from. And what I think it allows us to do is to explore her work in a much more interesting way. She's completely unconcerned in any of her plays or her poetry with what was believed to be her home county. She's not at all interested in the English countryside. She is, however, very, very interested in the colonies. And her second novel, Orinoco, is notoriously about slavery and the examination of the slave trade, which features an enslaved man as a hero. One of her other plays, The Widow Ranter, also explores the possibilities for women to rise up the social scale in the New World. And I think that's her upbringing. She's too knowledgeable about it. And she writes in a way which would have been perceived as, in the Restoration time, as an immigrant to London. And I think that really changes the complexity and the complexion of how we interpret her plays. It also explains to a large degree the mysterious holes in what is admittedly a very scanty kind of factual biography. If she started life in the Americas, we wouldn't have to explain how she got to Suriname, which is very short-lived, which is an English colony, where I think she was also possibly first employed as a spy. We wouldn't have to explain how a barber's daughter from Canterbury went to the Americas and came back and was then employed by Thomas Killigrew on other spying missions. It just makes much more sense to think that she comes from the Americas. It would also offer us a way of exploring her education, which is evidently excellent. She speaks various different languages. The fact that she spoke French and Dutch fluently without an accent, that she was familiar with Catholicism, which obviously in Puritan England was not something that one could find readily available. It was outlawed at one stage. And look, I'm not trying to claim that I know definitively that Aphra Behn was American. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that if we open ourselves up to the possibility that this could be the answer to her biographical riddle, it actually explains a great deal more about her than we presently know. And it makes much more sense of her life. And I guess I would also like to say it does make me feel a bit mean because I understand that the city of Canterbury, because they thought that she was born there, is in the process of erecting a statue of Aphra Behn. And look, I'm all for statues of famous women. I love the idea, but I don't think she was from Canterbury. And that makes me feel a bit unkind to the people of Canterbury. So I'm sorry about that. And I'm sorry that this throws a bit of a slight on Aphra Behn, but I honestly don't think that that's where she came from. Another slight contention that I really wanted to talk to you about is this belief that she didn't write her novel Love Letters. And there is a theory that she was not the authoress of that novel. But again, if you read the novel, if you look at the way in which it's constructed, if you look at the information which is carried through, she's writing this book in a sense of real time. You know, volume 1 actually focuses 100% on the Henrietta story. It then travels to the continent and becomes involved with the Monmouth Rebellion and concludes with Ford Lord Grey's character, triumphant. In terms of what we do know about Aphra's life, about her travels, about the kind of people with whom she associated, her connection with the Secret Service, it makes complete sense to me that she was able to write this novel because, frankly, she's privy to some quite inside information. So what I'm doing effectively is debunking the myth that she didn't write it. I absolutely believe that she did. But also looked at thematically in terms of the themes of her other works, particularly the way she writes about women. You know, she was heavily criticized in her own lifetime for presenting women in what was seen as a very scandalous way, in an admittedly sexually licentious age. Aphra Behn's heroines are sassy. They are. You know, they expose the hypocrisies of women's lives and the constraints placed upon women's lives. It's what I loved about them. You know, the preoccupation of Aphra's poetry, where she includes incredible ideas about libertarianism, you know, what constitutes freedom for women, Arcadianism, they're also very much present in her novel. But what I think is particularly interesting is the emphasis. The realistic emphasis which Aphra places on the lives of the lower classes. The idea that she wasn't the author, okay, maybe she wasn't, and various other people have been put forward, but she has an intimate and knowledgeable sense of the lives of the lower classes, which would fit much better with her biography, what we have of it, than any of the other fugitive authors of the novel. And as we're talking about love letters, I thought that I'd also give you a bit of a rundown on what happens in it and how it's connected to Henrietta's life. The plot of Love Letters, you know, the first volume is almost precisely based on Henrietta's life and the trial that her father brought at the King's Bench. The characters are obviously renamed, but otherwise it's pretty much exactly the same scenario. The sister, the conspiring servants, the interfering mother. And what's particularly thrilling, I think, about it, and what must have been very exciting, very, very exciting to readers of the age, is that the book is presented as a true life account. That is, we are supposed to be reading the genuine letters which pass between the characters. And of course, the letters are a real part of the trial. The discovery of the affair was made because Henrietta's mother discovered a letter from her to Ford Lord Grey. And strangely, her sister acted as a go-between, carrying and hiding letters that were later read out in court. They're almost the exact characters in the real-life court cases as they are in her novel. So it was a very radical thing to do at the time. You know, we're quite accustomed now to, I guess, fiction being presented as true life, which is actually genuinely real life. You know, we're not so much accustomed to that in the 17th century. And so this is a really exciting way to create a story based upon current events, which would engage the readers for the first time. In the second and third volumes, where the action actually shifts to the Netherlands and eventually back to England, the novel becomes much more political. But again, what we see is the same characters, Lord Ford Grey's characters, you know, kind of carried on throughout. Duke of Monmouth is satirized, as is his mistress. So the story stays very closely to what was happening in the political arena in the 1680s. And Aphra Behn was uniquely placed to really know what was going on. So society was obviously scandalized by Henrietta's affair and the subsequent trial, but obviously by Aphra's independent-minded heroines with their wit and their sass. So how did they take her novel? And did it prove to be equally as scandalizing? It absolutely did. Love Letters was an immediate bestseller when it was first published, and it actually carried on selling really, really well into the 18th century, long after Aphra's plays had kind of dropped out of production, and no one really remembered much about her poems, but it was probably her most successful work to date. Another interesting fact about it is that in 1682, when the trial actually takes place, which is the inspiration for the novel, Aphra Behn, despite having been very successful as a professional playwright, was completely broke. She'd been involved in a censorship dispute about one of her works, and it was presently forbidden for her plays to be performed on the stage. And I think what's credible to her is that she never made any bones about the fact that she then had to write to earn her keep. She effectively wrote for money. She didn't have any family means. She seems to have mislaid Mr. Behn somewhere on the voyage from Suriname. Certainly her husband never makes an appearance. So she was very much an independent woman in every sense of the word. Again, chronologically, we can assume that since she couldn't make any money from her plays, from about 1682, she had to turn her hand to something else to support herself. And what she then did was write a novel. So we've spoken about her unique position in writing about Henrietta's life. I then wondered, if I explored love letters, could we actually get closer to Aphra herself? And the conclusion that I came to is that I think we can get close to Aphra's voice, to her sense of humor, and to her political views, but not much else. She was a staunch Tory, very much against the Monmouth Revolution, very much against the real characters who were involved in it. She was also consistently, through her work, interested in the hypocrisies of power, the compromises that people had to make to obtain power, and the social gloss that they then put on it in order to make those compromises publicly acceptable. So what we do get is very much a sense of her ideology, the way that she thought. What we can't get perhaps so well, apart from her affinity and familiarity with the lives of the lower classes, is how Aphra herself lived. Even now, we know very little about her personal life. We do know that she lived in the London region of Whitefriars. We know that apparently she made an absolutely mean milk punch. And there is actually a recipe for it in the book. And I definitely wouldn't recommend anyone trying it. I tried it, and it seems the most impossibly drunk-making thing you could ever make. We also know that she liked fine clothes and that she had her portrait painted at least once. Beyond that, we know little about her private life or about her relationships. I think what we also see is a professional woman going about the business of the theatre, corresponding with her publisher, getting her plays produced, working with her actors and her actresses. She was incredibly professional about the whole thing. And also we know about her great friendship with the most fabulously brilliant and filthy poet of the age, the Earl of Rochester. They were incredibly close, and she wrote a beautiful eulogy to him on his premature death at the ripe young age of 33. And just to come back to an earlier point, the idea that the Earl of Rochester, who whilst was very fond of slumming, was extremely mindful of his status. And this was another clue for me. And that he would have been a friend and an admiring and respected friend to a barber's daughter from Canterbury. I think it's absolutely absurd. So I guess then the question is, by zooming in on Henrietta and Aphra, how close can we actually get to the motivators and the drivers of the young women of this period? Well, I think poor Henrietta's story is a cautionary tale. She, in a sense, was an Aphra Behn heroine. She was independent. She made the choice to defy her family and defy society to be with the man that she loved. She was bold, she was spirited, she was courageous, and yet her life ended very sadly. She had several children by Ford Lord Grey, none of whom lived. Her family were estranged to her for the rest of her life. Grey actually grew tired of her, and she was stuck with this husband, William Turner, which was a marriage of convenience, and they don't appear to have had a very happy or affectionate relationship whatsoever. She tried unsuccessfully several times to recover money, which she claims were owed to her from the Earl of Berkeley's fortune, and she never succeeded in that either. And Sadly, she died alone and obscure. Gray actually admitted her pension to sustain her when she was older, which was about £200 a year, which was exactly the same amount of money that her parents had offered to recover her, if you remember. So in a sense, I think Henrietta's life displays the tensions between, I guess the ideal of female freedom, which Aphra Behn did so brilliantly on the stage, and the reality of a world where women still had very few rights and very little chance of independence, and certainly very few possibilities if they were part of the upper echelons of society of making their own romantic choices. So all the time I was actually reading that book, I was rooting for Henrietta. I so wanted Henrietta to have a happy ending. Despite the scandal, despite all that she'd done, I really wanted things to work out for her, and they didn't. And, it didn't really work out that well for Aphra either. She died like Henrietta. She wasn't well off. She had never been given a position at court. And although, look, she had a grand funeral and there was a beautiful epitaph, which is actually visible today in Westminster Abbey. She never achieved the financial solidity or the social position which was bestowed upon men who considered themselves her equals as professional writers. And all of that because she was a woman. So I think in both these stories, we can see women who tried in different ways to move against the grains of their time, and in the end were quite firmly slapped down by a society that was ruled by men. I then wondered in the subsequent years if the intervening centuries between then and now, whether Henrietta and Aphra were treated kindly. Interestingly, Virginia Woolf, who I mentioned in the popular Bloomsbury podcast earlier on, she wrote an essay in which she mentions Aphra, and she says that all women ought to shower her grave with flowers because it was Aphra Behn who earned them the right to speak their minds. And that's absolutely an amazing statement. Between Aphra's death and the time that Virginia Woolf wrote that essay, she had very much fallen out of fashion. Now, on the contrary, thanks to her plays, the most famous of which is The Rover, and also her novel Orinoco, she is a subject of great interest to scholars, particularly with the trends in recent history scholarship to explore the transatlantic slave trade and, the attendant horrors, and also, interestingly, ideas about colonialism as in linked to gender. I think that's fabulous. Aphra Behn has actually become very fashionable, and there's a huge body of remarkable scholarly kind of literature devoted to her now. So yeah, look, I think her legacy, I think it's a very rich and potent one, and one which, as I hope that this book illustrates, that there's still a great deal to explore and to discover about. Hopefully what I've done through this podcast is kind of painted an extraordinary picture of Aphra for you. And this is what drew me to her story. For me, it was the idea of her as a woman who appeared alone out of nowhere, who managed by will and drive and talent to maybe achieve a place within a patriarchal, snobbish society of extremely cliquey male writers. And you know what? She did that just by talent alone. She didn't have any connections. She didn't have any money. She hadn't been to any of the favorite universities, and she hadn't been to court. She's a woman whose talent absolutely just shone out by the pure factor that she was talented and that she was bold enough and determined enough to claw her way to her rightful place. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I think she is so inspiring. Reading Aphra Behn's books now, I then wondered if perhaps there were common threads that continue to confront society today. And you know what? I came to the conclusion that her books are actually a hoot. They're so funny. They're fabulously sexy. They're very clever. The characters are incredibly vivid, and they're a really racy kind of fun read. But I also came to the conclusion that if we think that our age has invented social media and gossip and, the interest in the lives of the rich and the famous through the tabloids, absolutely not. The 17th century was just as compelled and fascinated by these things that we are guilty of today. And I think what's really sad is that the 17th century can seem such a remote world, so removed from where we are today. It was so driven by civil war. It was so obsessed with religious preoccupations, which most 21st century people don't really understand or care about, to be honest. But when you read love letters, this world comes alive, and it's a book that actually draws you into the streets of 17th century London. You're there, you're witness to what's taking place. You know, these are real characters engaged in real plots and real affairs, speaking in a very fresh, funny, accessible way. And I think it makes the 17th century a much more human place than it's commonly considered. It's an incredibly readable book by an authoress who did the most amazing things just over 300 years ago. And hopefully, by what I've done here, has enhanced and perhaps enlightened you a little bit about a woman that ordinarily you would never have heard of, who is absolutely worth exploring and worth a mention. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.